No, I mean architecture is political. We gotta add that stuff.
Indeed.
We're tearing down communities to build multifamily, and you have to understand we are creating displacement. You're displacing Black and brown folks, and they don't come back.
Half of this podcast would be dedicated to the history of Tyler House, my journey and my discoveries, and hey, I'm going to solve this housing problem.
Hey guys, what's up? My name is Melissa Daniels. This is the Architecturalist Political Podcast where Black and brown folks talk about architecture. I hope you enjoyed this podcast and be part of my storytelling. What does Black land ownership and reparations have to do with architecture? I didn't ask Corey Shaw Jr. that specific question, but it kind of morphed into that in playing back this episode. We talked about reparations. We talked about Black land ownership and how DC sold us land. We bought it. And then the government was like, nope, we need that back. And I think that that's a continuation up until this day. The AIA convention was in DC. I only attended 2 days. That was a Wednesday and a Thursday. I was not able to attend Friday and Saturday. For Wednesday, there was a workshop, and it focused on Northwest 1 and a NOMA Business Improvement District. Thursday, I did not attend the keynote. I did have an activity with the Housing Community Development Knowledge Community. And then I went on the expo floor to talk to exhibitors, and I sat in the Cybertruck, took some pictures of the Cybertruck. That thing is huge. I didn't realize how big it was. And of course, being in the Northeast, we rarely see those. Unlike some of my colleagues who live on the West Coast, San Francisco and so forth, they see this every day. There's also a puppy pen. I did not get a chance to play with the puppies. By the time I got over there, they were all gone. Let's see, what else was the highlights? I think that's it in summary. There was other things that were going on. I've been debating whether or not I should talk about it, but this isn't the time or place for me to mention any of that sort of stuff. Going back to the Wednesday workshop tour, there's an apartment complex that is on the site of DC Housing Authority, which we toured. Right now, it is located where the parking lot used to be. DC Housing Authority building is still there, but it will get demolished to build more. Well, it's a 3-phase project. So the first phase is complete. The second phase includes the demolition of the DC Housing Authority building and erecting phase 2. But I got some really cool pictures on the rooftop, and it overlooked pretty much Northwest 1. You saw Tyler House, Sibley Plaza, that condo building. I can't remember the name of that condo building. The area formerly known as Hersman Quarter. We also took a tour of the Rise at Temple Courts. That was also cool. We did not go on the roof for that one, but we did see the lobby as well as a couple of units and their communal space. After the tour, we went back to the convention center to have our panel discussion. And I was able to give a very brief reason as to how these areas came to be. The NOMA Business Improvement District came straight off their website. And then, of course, all of the research I've done so far about Northwest 1. In particular, how did that area came to be? Northwest 1, prior to urban renewal, people lived there. Individual homes or maybe alley units, I believe, where New York Avenue is. Right now it's a parking lot. I believe DC government owns that parking lot. There used to be housing similar to what's on the other side where Big Ben is. And that got torn down to put a parking lot. Even at the Rise at Temple Court, not so much townhomes or single family homes or own, I'm gonna say townhomes. Even then, they erected apartment buildings, and then Search from Quarter, or townhomes, and it was a co-op, and then they demolished it to put an apartment building, a large apartment building. What am I getting at here? Black land ownership and how DC's population of Black people is dwindling. And we're moving to PG County. We are moving to PG County. There's land there. We can afford it. And you get more for your money. Unlike DC, where 1.2 million may not give you that home. And this is all tied to reparations. Corey Shaw Jr., guest, is a DC native, longtime resident of Ward 7, graduated from Anacostia, and went to UDC. He is passionate for comprehending the needs of communities and helping them advocate and mobilize for structural change. He's a co-founder of the Black Broad Branch Project in his capacity as an oral historian and chair of the Policy Implementation Working Committee. He's advocated for reparations for 2 families whose ancestors were displaced from Chevy Chase, DC, which we got into a little bit. He's also the director of the DC Legacy Project, which is how I got to know him. I also want to make a note. Towards the end of this episode, I made a comment about bike lanes. I don't know if you know this, but I am passionate about bike lanes, as in I don't like them. And I said I used the word hate. I hated people who are for bike lanes. And hate is a strong word, like I mentioned in the episode. And I gave my reason why I'm not for bike lanes. But listening back to the conversation, I have softened it up to a sense that I think we can't just plop bike lanes everywhere. We need to be thoughtful about it and understand the context of the neighborhood, which we're not doing. Corey made a good point about Rock Creek Park and how they were able to separate the road from the bikers. And I think that we need to be more thoughtful and comprehensive when we place these bike lanes. My concern, and this is after an afterthought and listening to the episode again, a playback of it, it's an indication of who you want in the community. Because you never asked the community whether or not they want bike lanes. They wanted a grocery store. And Corey made a point of that in that correlation, that we don't get what we asked for, we get something else. So the community never asked for a bike lane. The community asked for a grocery store. And you're building something for someone else, which to me is a form of displacement. You can introduce things. I have no problem introducing, but how are you going to integrate it in the existing fabric? Because the goal is to make those people stay, right? We want that community that's been intact for generations to stay there and thrive. And whoever comes in to introduce themselves becomes part of the community, and the community becomes unique. We don't want 8th Street and the Wharf to be the same. We don't want 14th and U and Georgetown to be the same. But we need to be careful so that we don't have that. Because we put a Walmart in all these districts, in all these areas, it may be successful, it may fail. But you can't just plop it. What does the community want? And in regards to bike lanes, we're not asking that question. We're not going to that Black church that's been there for a very long time. Again, I mentioned this later on in the episode. We're not doing that. I say we, but the people who are making these decisions aren't talking to people that live there. Instead, what they do is they come in and present, this is what we're going to do. And people are like, I don't like it. Tough cookie, you got to move your car. You can't park here anymore. And that's not, I think that we need to change that. So, in summary, I don't mean the word hate, even though I said hate. I don't hate you. Okay? I just wish there were I wish that when we go into a community and introduce something new, let's take our time and understand what we're doing. This is a huge ask because it's very difficult because you can have meetings and everybody's in agreement. And then when you finally put in, you have petitions in uproar because none of those people attended or read the pamphlets or whatever. It's very hard work. It's very hard work to be in the community. And that's why you have ANCs. That's why you have community organizers. That's why you have people who are already on the ground to help you facilitate and to understand. There hasn't been a method that works. Or there is a method that works. It's just is not for us. Or it's not, the infrastructure hasn't been placed there. Because if we go to War 2, I think it's War 2. Ooh, my memory is getting bad. I can't remember what war. If you go up Wisconsin Avenue or even Georgetown, like it's solid there. Like it's very difficult to build multifamily housing on that side of DC because it's so strong and they've been fighting for it. Those NIMBYs been fighting it for a very long time. But that's just an example of strongness. I am getting off topic, guys. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this episode. It's always a pleasure to talk to Corey. And here you go. How you doing, Corey?
Doing all right. How are you?
I'm okay. I'm so glad I get to talk to you outside of DC Legacy Project, get to know you a little bit more and your mission in life or non-mission. You could just be a free-spirited guy. We're about to find out. Can you tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. So my name is Corey Shaw Jr. I'm the director of the DC Legacy Project. When I'm not working, I tend to either find myself sort of grilling, cooking, doing fun stuff, try to hang out with friends a little more these days. I am from the city. I've lived in Ward 7 all my life and happy to call the city home. I am a graduate of Anacostia Senior High School. I graduated in, oh God, I'm dating myself and I feel terrible about doing that, but like 2017, 2018. And then I went to UDC. I got my undergraduate degree a couple of years ago, or a couple of years in May, in political science and global studies. And while I was there, I was writing an undergraduate thesis on reparations. And so that I think is really what sort of started my journey to sort of how I got to this place today where I'm doing lots of community organizing.
When did that spark happen? Was it at UDC or did something happen while you were going to Anacostia?
No, I think that like as a kid, I was always fascinated by the issue of reparations. Like seriously, my uncle he wasn't a Rastafarian, but like he subscribed to that sort of line of thinking and the sort of repatriation of Black folk to Africa and sort of a true place for Black Americans someplace in the world. Even so, as a kid, like that was the energy that I was sort of growing up around. And so I've always sort of been fascinated by like the Black liberation struggle. My grandfather, and this is something that I've sort of come to recognize a little more now that I've gotten older. My grandfather was Thurgood Marshall's barber while he was at the Supreme Court. And so like that was something that like as a kid I didn't quite understand, but like as I got older, I came to understand that like the stories, for example, that my grandfather would tell me about Thurgood Marshall fleeing the South, right? Like those weren't lullabies, those weren't bedtime stories, like that was real. And he was like giving me barbershop talk in the moment as a kid. And I didn't quite know what to do with it at the time. But as I've gotten older, a moment for me that I think really sort of shined through, I went to the MLK library, I think while I was in college doing research. And by that time, like the library had been renovated. They, put up the Poor People's Campaign exhibit. And I was like walking through and I saw these buttons from the Poor People's Campaign with like Dr. King's face on it and all these other things. And it's like, oh, that's so cool. Like my grandfather like said he was there, let me, go talk to Pops. And so I went to talk to Pops and I was like, Pops, I got to take you to this place. And for context, my grandfather, like he had a stroke. He wasn't walking all that well. He really didn't need to be driving, but that's a whole other animal. And when I started telling him about it, he just like, he was sitting there, like smile, his big smile on his face, like he wanted to say something. And he sort of cut me off and was like, What I want you to do is like go upstairs, go into my room, close the door. On the back of the door is a lanyard. Go grab the lanyard. It's yours. I was like, okay, I don't know why you want me to have a lanyard, Pops, but okay. And what he gave me was a postcard of the March on Washington during the Obama years. And then, but like pinned to each one of like the corners were the same buttons I saw in this exhibit at the MLK Library on the Poor People's Campaign, with like the same patina, like rusted sort of vintage vibe to it. It was in that moment that I think I came to realize, like, oh, I've been walking this path, and it's sort of like a continuation of the work that my grandfather had been doing. And I don't want to call it work, but like all Black folk were in some way, shape, or fashion were engaged in the struggle in the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s. And so that's sort of how I think the spark got started. And, when I got to undergrad, it really sort of gave me the opportunity, because the way that UDC sort of like teaches students is in the political science program, at least. I won't speak for all the programs, but for political scientists, the thing that you're sort of tasked with doing for the 4 years that you're in school is writing this massive, like 10 to 15 page paper on a particular issue that is research based. And I was at odds with a couple of my professors initially, because I really wanted to write a paper about, I can't remember what it was, but it was like something off the wall, like just didn't make sense at the time. Like I wanted to do like some sort of research about housing in DC, but like it was just all over the place. It was too much for an undergrad student to do. So they were sort of like trying to talk me back. And then I was like, well, if I can't do like this sort of like housing justice paper, I want to write a paper on reparations. And of course they like doubled down and were like, Corey, that's even more like, I don't feel like you're understanding what we're telling you. But I stuck with it. And over time, I sort of worked on this paper, and it's not published. I will not publish it because I think it's bad. But that said, I wrote my paper on a project that I was fortunate enough to found after doing a class at UDC. Shout out to Dr. Amanda Huron, who reached out to me and was like, "Hey, I know you're writing this paper on reparations. I'm about to do this oral history project that I think could be relevant to the work you're trying to do in this paper. You need to be in this class." And so I had to apply to get in the class. I got in the class, and the project itself was conducting the oral histories with 8 descendants of 2 families that lived in Chevy Chase, DC back in like 1840 to 1936. And at the time, I didn't quite understand the gravity of the work that we were doing. But like it was an oral history project, right? The task is to sort of, to the layperson, the task is to go in and talk to these people, understand the history, and that's it, right? Like you're in and you're out. You do the oral history interview. And I approached it from that perspective as I was sort of walking into the class. And that was quickly upended, right? Like I didn't have any formal training as an oral historian. And so, or really any of the students, none of the students, I think it was like 16 of us, none of us had training as oral historians. And so we were trained by Benji de la Piedra, who is an oral historian and a mastercraft at the art of conducting an interview. And that changed the perspective a bit. And so I started to approach the work differently and really became like person centric. I wanted to know more about these people because I wanted to understand where they fit into a larger historical narrative that, historically erases Black faces and Black people, Black narratives. And so we did these interviews. My interview was with a gentleman who passed away in January, but is still with us in spirit, James Fisher, who is 7 generations removed, the descendant of Captain George Poynter, who was born in 1773, enslaved, bought his freedom at the age of 19, went on to buy land, build a cabin, and work for George Washington for the rest of his life. And so I did that work over the course of like 2 semesters. There was a spring semester class that was like students at UDC. The summer session was a class with high school students. And so we did that work. And that is really what I think catapulted me down this path, because once I did the work here in DC, I realized that there was a whole movement around reparations going on in the country. Right? This is the same time, just for like context, like George Floyd was killed, murdered for that matter. Bruce's Beach was sort of popping off in California. The sort of Where's My Land movement was sort of gaining a resurgence in this country. It all happened sort of at this sort of firestorm where everything was happening. Evanston, Illinois had just passed their reparations bill. And so I think that is sort of like the 3 big moments for me that, like, I guess you could say sparked, how I got on this path.
Is there a correlation with reparations and land?
Oh, for sure. I mean, you can't really have a conversation with reparations if we're not talking about land, right? I think, if you're talking strictly policy, There's Sherman Special Field Orders, right, which is 40 acres and a mule, right? So even at its inception, reparations is a land-based sort of remedy in the American context. What we've seen over the last 5 or 6 years is land is becoming the center of a lot of fights because so many Black people were robbed of land, right? And so I would say certainly it's there, but I think that dependent upon how you're approaching a historical narrative, land might not necessarily be the issue. If we're talking about racially discriminatory housing in Washington, D.C., for example, in the 50s and the 60s, where nobody really owned land in the first place, or rather the sort of reality of land ownership in DC was changing because there were landowners, but a lot of them were parceling their land up, selling it to the city, and then selling the homes on the property, which is the sort of current system we have now by and large. But that land piece is absolutely imperative, I think, to the conversation on reparations.
I think it's amazing. So I am on this, I'm calling it a side journey because, as with any other projects that anyone, especially me, take, I'm trying to find Black architects in the city. And there's this book that lists a couple of them. It stops maybe in the 80s or something, maybe 70s, 80s. And so I started looking, it's of the United States. It's not just with DC. So when I looked in the section of DC, he lists the state, the description of the property, whether it's residential, commercial, what kind of commercial it is, the date. I don't know what the date is based off of, whether it's the date of the building being completed or the date, like, I don't know, and the architect. So I didn't want to deal with residential. I didn't want to deal with that. I started with commercial, and then it ended up across the river and this area near Kenilworth called Eastland. So Eastland Gardens, similar to Berry Farms, where you have Black land ownership, but then a goddamn highway, 295, cut it in half, basically. And so during the 50s, 16 Black architects built a bunch of homes there of all types of styles, including postmodern. And I took a little drive around there, and sure enough, there's some beautiful mid-century modern homes that were designed by Black architects. And I was like, wow. And then there's a tour that DC Preservation does tours, did a brochure. I was like, where was this? I didn't know about this. My question, I guess, to you is this rabbit hole that I went down on. Have you come across that either in your oral histories besides Berry Farms and Eastland that I just mentioned about land ownership being taken away, or some crazy story that someone has told you in regards to that?
That is, in essence, the first project that I did while I was in college. And so, if I may, I'll take some time to sort of speak about the history. I mentioned Captain George Pointer, born and enslaved in 1773, buys his freedom I can't remember the year, but at the age of 19, gets married. He works for George Washington for the rest of his life. He lives in Montgomery County at the time, which is now, one of the wealthiest neighborhoods or counties in Maryland. He lives up by Cabin John in Lock 6 along the C&O Canal. He is one of the formerly enslaved people who was responsible for the construction of the canal, right? So you can credit him with helping to build one of the first maritime transportation networks in the country, along with several other hundreds of African Americans who were enslaved and manumitted. When he bought his freedom, he went on to become a captain of fleets that sailed materials for the construction of the city in and out of Washington from the Shenandoah Valley. When the C&O Canal, because I don't want to get into like the history of the Potomac River Company, but like it goes bankrupt, the C&O Canal Company buys them, the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal Company buys the Potomac River Company and proposes a route revision to the canal. And that route revision would have destroyed his cabin. And so the reason we know the history is because two historians that wrote a book called Between Freedom and Equality. It's a fantastic book. I recommend everybody read it. But they discovered this letter that he wrote in September of like 1832 or 1834, where he's essentially recapping his entire life in handwritten sort of like 1700s pre-colonial calligraphy. It's beautiful. And he recounts his entire life from enslavement to manumission to the work that he did for George Washington, and ends that letter with essentially begging them not to destroy his cabin. He died 2 years after after he wrote that letter, and his cabin was destroyed, and they built the C&O Canal where it is today. His granddaughter, while he was alive, was wanted to get married when she got of age, and so she married a man by the name of Thomas Harris. She and Thomas were sort of torn between whether or not they were going to live in Montgomery County, near where her aunt lived, or if she wanted to live in Georgetown, where her uncle William lived. At the same time that all of that is happening, the Nat Turner uprising pops off, right? This is the largest slave revolt in history. When that happens, racial tensions in Georgetown are very high. There's actually records of race riots taking place in Georgetown at the time. And so they decide it's not safe to live in Georgetown. So they go to Chevy Chase, which was then Dry Meadows. They settled there when they were there from 1840 to 1928. They lived remarkable lives. Now, getting to this notion of sort of development architecture, the Chevy Chase Land Company, or really, like, I'll sort of give you the presentation piece, right? In 1890, right, there's a couple of things that happened. By the time we got to 1890, Mary and Thomas Harris had been married for about 54 years, right? That's longer than the life expectancy at the time. Their marriage outlived the life expectancy. At the same time, in 1890, the Chevy Chase Land Company is formed. And the Chevy Chase Land Company is owned by a gentleman by the name, I don't know why I want to call him a gentleman, but a man named Francis Newlands, who was an outspoken white supremacist. And he wanted to build an all-white suburb in Maryland at first. And so he did that. He bought thousands of acres of property in Maryland and built a white suburb that we know now today as Chevy Chase. When he finished in Maryland, he turned his attention to Washington, D.C. And so by the time we get to 1919, or really like 1920, the two families here, because there's George Pointer and there's another family whose history goes back to 1754, descended from a woman born and enslaved in Mount Vernon who was raped and forced to have children, and those children were emancipated, and they end up living next to these other family. So both these families end up being immediate neighbors in Chevy Chase, D.C., with connections to George Washington, one of whom is actually descended from George Washington, for that matter. We get to this moment in like 1920 where both families are surrounded by a white enclave, where their single family lots have been parceled up and their homes on those properties, and they all have racially restrictive covenants. And so the sort of conversation they have to have is, well, what are we going to do? And that's decided for them because the city lobbies the federally appointed government for a park and a school, and they get it. And where else do they want to put it but where this Black family is living, or in close proximity to it? I say close proximity because if you look at a map from 1936 that shows you the original structure, it was nowhere near the school, nowhere near where the families were. And for that matter, there's a newspaper clipping that we have that was discovered by a woman, Kate Atkinson, from historic Chevy Chase, D.C., from the Evening Star at the time, that essentially says that they thought that the colored tenants of this building, air quotes of colored tenants, would be a cause of tension and friction with this all-white school. And so they decided it would just be best to have it removed. And so they're pushed out of Chevy Chase. The Pointer Harris family goes to Georgetown. The Branham Dorsey Shorter family, who lived next to them, went to Reno City. They were pushed out of Reno City because Reno City was cleared in the 30s. And so they found their way from Reno City to Adams Morgan, where they still have a house today, but no one's living in it. And, that's sort of the situation that they're in. The other family goes from Chevy Chase, D.C., to Georgetown, to Southwest Washington, to Berry Farm. And in each of those instances, in the case of Georgetown, it's historic preservation that increases the property values and in turn the property taxes, and makes it much harder for generational homeowners to maintain home ownership. And so they lose those homes. Southwest Washington, it's urban renewal that pushes families out of Southwest Washington and into communities east of the river. And so there's this moment in like the 50s where the families have found one of the families rather has found their way to Berry Farm. And so the interesting thing to me as a matter of understanding policy, to sort of get to what you're talking about in terms of Black placemaking and then highways and things of that nature, is that if you look at the development of Chevy Chase, D.C. and Berry Farm, it's very, very different. Right, Chevy Chase, D.C. was a rural sort of part of Washington County. Berry Farm, for that matter, is also a part of a rural area that was known as Washington County outside of the federal city of Washington. However, Southeast Washington was a segregated white community. There was racial zoning. There were Jim Crow laws that were strictly enforced after emancipation. Chevy Chase doesn't necessarily deal with that because it's still a rural township for the most part. right? There is no sort of county government out there. People are just living. Yes, they live in close proximity to enslavement, right? Yes, they have to provide manumission paperwork to buy land, right? But once they have it, they live in relative peace as compared to the Black codes in Georgetown, for example. And so when you get to this moment where these families have gone from Chevy Chase to Berry Farm over the course of roughly 38 years, the really bizarre thing is that Chevy Chase, DC has gone from being what was an integrated space where Black folk could sort of flee the racial tensions to being explicitly a white suburb, because a lot of those homes had racially restrictive covenants on them. And Southeast DC, in particular areas like Berry Farm and historic Anacostia, go from being segregated white spaces to being spaces where Black folk are being relegated to after white folk have been complaining about dilapidated infrastructure for generations. And so these moments of, it sounds like Eastland Gardens might also be a part of this trend of introducing larger Black home owning communities, right? In the case of Berry Farm, a tenement community, and saying, we're going to put these communities in such close proximity to white folk that they're going to want to leave. And that's what we see in historic Anacostia is that, shortly after Nolan v. Sharp and the desegregation of schools in Southeast Washington, white folks start to flee, and they either leave the city altogether, or a lot of them move to upper Northwest and they move west of the river. And so these communities that once were segregated, explicitly white spaces are now Black spaces implicitly, right? And as a result of that matter, the infrastructure is dilapidated, right? It's things like that the history of Anacostia warranted a historic designation. And I'm speaking specifically about the school, right? The school is a historic landmark, but that history isn't grounded in the desegregation of the school. It's grounded in a lot of the sort of modernist architecture that they sort of quote and say that, we can't touch this place, right? It's a sacred space. But now there's a Black community there that really wants to try and refurbish the school, has been trying for years. We can't do that, right? Because it's a historic building. We can't touch the infrastructure east of the river because it's historic for these particular reasons. And so in some ways, the preservation of architecture sort of hindered what we can and can't do east of the river. On another hand, as it relates to sort of highways being introduced to communities, anybody that thinks 295 sits where it is just because it sits where it is missing the point. They sort of threw the ball and you saw it fly by, but you really didn't see it fly by. A lot of the highways in this country, not the city, the country, are where they are because of one man, Carlin Bartholomew. He was on the Interstate Highway Commission. He was appointed by the president at the time. And his whole thing was putting highways in Black communities and cutting them in half. He did it in Richmond. He did it all over the South. And he did it in DC. 295 sits where it is because, as I understand it, he said he wanted it there. And when he left the commission, his successor put it there, right? And so those sorts of things are also not a mistake. And so the thing that I've really, I don't want to say enjoyed, but I found interesting over the years is conducting that research to sort of see how things have ended up the way that they are, and coming to understand that places look the way that they do because certain people live there or because certain people didn't. And as a result, the infrastructure that we have today is either thriving or failing as a result of past policy decisions.
A couple of weekends ago, I took that trip down to Eastland Gardens, and as well as some other places down there, including Frederick Douglass House. And I haven't been there since I was like 8. So before, I remember the hill that you climb up on, and then there's a park ranger there. He's like, hey, welcome. Blah, blah, blah. Now they have a visitor center. I'm like, when did this happen? It was interesting to say the least. Like, it's Anacostia. Remember it, how it is. On the other hand, there's some other new things that's around there that I was like, yo, what's going on? What do you think the future is, knowing the history?
I would be remiss if I didn't say I wasn't worried. The manner in which the city has developed, and this isn't to point the finger at current elected officials, the manner in which the city has developed is one that is forcibly pushed Black folk from place to place to place to place to place. And that is something I cannot ignore. That said, I'm worried because what I see happening, for example, where I live, they put a Planet Fitness up the street a few years ago. I didn't ask for a Planet Fitness. I sure didn't. I'm glad it's there. I get to work out 24 hours, whatever. Cool, fine. It's great. I didn't ask for a Planet Fitness. I wanted a grocery store. At a minimum, I wanted more housing, right? Something I could get for myself, right? That didn't happen. And so what I'm seeing is that sometimes there are things that the community, and I don't want to say I am the community, but I'm a member of the community. And I imagine some people feel similarly because I've spoken with some other members of the community, right, who also wanted a grocery store that does not routinely have spoiled milk on the shelf. And so my concern is that there are all of these amenities to east of the river. And that's fantastic. And for the time being, the people that are here are either going to benefit from them or they'll boycott them, as some people do with busboys and poets. That said, my concern is that the amenities that are coming are not for us. My concern is that the things that are popping up, the niche coffee shops and little restaurants that are holes in the wall, they put a Miss Toya's up the street from me, which is like they got one in Silver Spring. This is the only other one, to my knowledge, that they got is over here. Highlands opened up a restaurant over here. They make fantastic empanadas, and I'm happy to have them. But like those sorts of things that are coming, I worry that what is going to follow is not going to be consistent development for people that live here. I've been a long proponent of affordable housing policy. And that's sort of, I guess, the job that I'm doing now is sort of advocating for more just affordable housing policy. The moment that we're in the city's history is one where we haven't really realized any actual potential in the affordable housing stock in a meaningful way for people east of the river, right? People east of the river are still dealing with concentrated poverty, systemic poverty. And it's because we are piecemealing solutions for a larger problem that is racial capitalism. Instead of addressing a myriad of issues like social services and housing and substance abuse, we are trying to say, well, we're just going to focus on this being housing or this being social services. And all it does is sort of put a band-aid on a hole in a sinking ship. And so we get to this place where we got a budget shortfall, there's all these things happening, and we want to cut budgets for this, and this, and that, and that, and that. And the people that are going to bear the brunt are the people that live east of the river. 5, 7, and 8, if we're going to be inclusive, wards 5, 7, and 8, but the bulk of those folks live east of the river. And to me, these things are connected, right? Because we can't have a conversation about what's coming without understanding what's happening at this particular moment. I worry that what is coming is what came to Chevy Chase. I worry that what's coming is what came to Southwest Washington. And that if you are not a part of some, however it manifests, Black bourgeoisie, you won't have a place in the city. I firmly believe that's like my biggest fear. DC will be Atlanta in some cases. And we'll just have east of the river be Wakanda, and that's going to be it.
Right. Is architecture political?
Absolutely. If I didn't make it clear, I think that's the case. I think in particular, I think historic architecture is political.
Because there's a difference between, right, with policy and design. That's why I always ask that question.
So what I would like to see, and this is something that I haven't seen, somebody mentioned one before, the nation's public housing stock, for example, was segregated when it was created. And so what I'd like to see is what these different housing projects look like. There was one up by Barracks Road that was a segregated white public housing project that is no longer there. And then there's Berry Farm, and there's a few others. And so what I'd like to see is like, what did these places look like? How were they constructed? That would be something that I think could be an interesting sort of avenue to explore the political nature of architecture. Because if it comes out that Berry Farm was constructed relatively, poorly in comparison to some of the segregated white public housing complex back in the 40s and the 50s, or the 30s for that matter, I think it becomes even more clear. The nation at that particular moment wasn't really interested in building housing as a right, insofar as everyone was entitled to the same thing.
It's interesting. I always felt that the reason why they had public housing is to house some Black and brown folks. And they only did that because they stole their land. Like they were all like shanty towns or like, alley, with the alley dwelling or whatever. You know what I mean? Like, and justification is, well, we're going to move you out, build this new thing. Sounds familiar, right? Build this new thing, and then you can come on in with all these restrictions and all that good stuff.
Yeah, that's definitely an element of it. I think the sort of national context, right, is that, well, the international context is that America is exploring public housing at the same moment that nations like Sweden and Norway are. And if you look at those nations and how their public housing stock is manifested, and their social safety net for that matter, it is dramatically different from how it manifested in America. And that's because I would argue the introduction of austerity era politics into conversations around how we take care of our citizens at a fundamental level made it impossible to create a universal housing as a right, affordable housing system. And so there's that piece. And I think that that gets to a larger conversation that we can have about the trappings of systemic poverty. But I think the point that you're making rings incredibly true when we talk about Barry Farm. Barry Farm was a landowning community in 1867. They demolished it, one, to build Suitland Parkway, two, to build Bowling Air Force Base, and three, to build the Barry Farm dwellings. Right. And so that is an instance very clearly where they decided, well, for one, there were a lot of Black folk in Southwest Washington at the time. And Southwest Washington, similarly to Anacostia, was a segregated white community. And they did not want Black people living near them. And so they lobbied the federal government again. And the federal government caved, decided to take the land from Black landowners in Southeast Washington at Barry Farm, the landowning community, and replaced it with public housing, and then put Black people in that community and trapped them in systemic poverty. I think that there's definitely merit to it. I think that if we're talking about the sort of trappings of land theft, conversations to me that would be a bit more relevant would be like stuff around eminent domain. There's a community down in Georgia, for example, that had land taken from them during World War II because the Department of Defense said that there were German U-boats off the coast of Georgia. And there's some newspaper articles and things like that that suggest that that was true. And so they used eminent domain to take thousands of acres of property from a Black landowning community and never built the military base they swore up and down they were going to build on this property. And later, instead of giving the land back, they gave it to the state, and the state turned it into a wildlife refuge. And so these sorts of things, I think, we can have a conversation there about, like, what does land theft and so on and so forth mean for.
And that kills me going to Northwest One, and it's on K Street. And only recently they were able to Temple Court. There you go. It was Temple Court. I remember as a kid when they tore that down. Now people have moved in, maybe like 2, 3 years ago. They've moved in. This is decades. And what killed me, what prompted me to remember that is they tore it down and it stood there growing grass. That's the killer part, right? When they tear down these places, they don't build right away. It sits there for a couple of decades, depending, and then they dig a hole. And then it takes them forever to build. Meanwhile, over at Noma, buildings are growing like weeds. Like cranes are in the sky, and in a year's time, you got a building, and people are occupying that building. Versus, when the government is involved, it takes decades.
I think part of that is also the fact of the way the city's developed, right? Noma, Gallaudet, Ivy City, right? That area, property values have been low for a minute, but they sort of fell, I think, at their lowest pit during the early 2000s, right? And so it made the market ripe for redeveloping that area and bringing things like the Ivy City Smokehouse, bringing things like Compass Coffee and Mom's Organic, and now the Hex apartments and things, right? That's why that area has had a resurgence. It was cheap to build, but it is not cheap to build downtown at the intersection of K and New York. You know what I mean? And so that dynamic is real. And it is unfortunately the bed that the federal government and the city in some cases laid for themselves, and that, we let the city develop in a certain way. The federal city less much, but outside the city, we've let the city develop a certain way. And so now it's really, really expensive to build in certain places. And so it makes it much, much harder to change the way that these places look because it's super expensive. I think that what the city should do more of is spending potentially capital funds on the communities instead of dropping $500 million to keep the Capitals and the Wizards at Capital One Arena.
Well, again, it's who you catering to, right? Like,
Right.
who's your audience? Who's your donors? Who will vote for you? Those are the people that you need to please.
Yeah.
So switching lanes to your current job of Empower DC, what kind of things are you guys up to nowadays?
Yeah, so I'm the director of the DC Legacy Project. The Legacy Project is an effort that formed out of the fight for housing at Berry Farm. Empower DC had been organizing with the tenants, I think going back to 2011. I was corrected recently. And we've been advocating for a build in place strategy. When that was unsuccessful, the demolition was clear, was authorized rather. The end result was Empower DC deciding to seek a historic designation for a whole swath of buildings on the site, but it was successful in preserving 5 buildings of historical significance. Adam A. Horn, one of the leaders of the National Welfare Rights Organization, lived in one of those buildings. Lillian Wright, a local tenant advocate, lived in that one of those buildings. And then the Jennings sisters, who were plaintiffs in the Bowling v. Sharp case that went before the Supreme Court, also lived in one of those buildings. And so lots of history there, and we're grateful to have, had that win. Now our focus is how can we preserve the space? And so we've been working with a number of different partners without saying a lot. We've met with some decision makers. We met with the developer at least once. I have to talk about the property and the future, and we're making progress. I don't know that everybody loves me, and I don't think that they need to, but I firmly believe that we're moving in the right direction in helping to realize a vision that the community helped give us. And so before I got the position, there were, I want to say, like 5 or 6 events that were held in like late 2022, early 2023 around what exactly those buildings could do for the community. And we invited the community out, and they showed up in droves. I think in 1 or 2 of those events, we had over 100 people show up. I don't know if they were inwardly, but I think we had a couple of events where there was like a little over 100 people that showed up. And we had these thought sessions, and there was, of course, the Berry Farm Community Land and Justice film that was created during that process. And so, using that film as a medium to sort of imagine a different future for the community. And what came out of that was, the community really wanted to see, one, some historic preservation elements, right? They wanted to see something that honored the legacy of the site, going back to 1867 all the way up to 2019, so that people don't forget about the legendary people that used to live here, right? The children of Frederick Douglass, the first Black woman to get a PhD, and then the 3 women I mentioned earlier, among others. They also mentioned that they wanted to have some elements there that were community wellness oriented, right? They want to have some space for community healing on that site. They also would like to see some small business incubation opportunities, the opportunity to make something in Ward 8 for Ward 8, which is something that, there's not a lot of spaces like that east of the river. And if they are, I feel like they don't get enough time in the limelight, unfortunately, just as a matter of who gets attention when and where. And so they want to create this space that is sort of multifaceted and can address a number of the needs of the community. And so in that vein, we've been meeting with people and trying to advance that vision thus far.
Lastly, it's something that you said earlier in regards to public housing and what they do overseas. They do a wonderful job at social housing. That sparked a thought about the war on cars. City planners went over to Copenhagen and they saw, look at all these people riding bikes and walking 15 minutes everywhere, 15-minute cities, that sort of thing. And then they came back in the cities and it was like, we're going to install all these bike lanes and put no parking and make these 3 lanes into 1 lane and make this a one-way street. I hate those people. And I tell you why. Because places like Copenhagen is harmonious, right? Everybody looks the same. You have, of course, your sprinkles of browns, but it's the same. There are more white people than others, and they're putting it into cities where you have a very diverse population, diverse residents, as well as people coming in and out the
Mhm.
city. So they kind of forget all that stuff. And not everybody wants to bike everywhere. And not everybody who has kids want to drag along a wagon
Yeah,
behind them.
yeah.
What are your thoughts? I can go on for that. But what are your thoughts?
So I will say one. I think that what you're getting at is a larger sort of a sentiment in communities, in particular those east of the river, about bike lanes. People over here, we hear bike lanes and we get skittish because bike lanes to us means we don't ride bikes, right? So who's riding bikes in the community if it ain't us, right? I think that
We
that's one of the
do
main
ride
things.
bikes. I don't want to put that
Yes,
out there. I don't want to say that Black people don't ride bikes. Black people do ride
right.
bikes.
We ride bikes.
We do all that stuff. It's just, for example, churches.
Hmm.
Black churches that have been in that community since slavery. However, because of the community itself changing, we are in Upper Marlboro, we're in Suitland. We're not that far, but we're not in the city. We're not in that neighborhood anymore. So they
Yeah,
drive into the church. There's no parking
yeah,
because there's a bike lane that
yeah.
even they don't use. That's another thing. They don't use the bike lane. Anyway, go ahead.
No, I mean, so I think the thing for me is that one, the city has developed in a way that a lot of the African American communities happen to be urban suburbs, and they are urban car dependent suburbs for that matter. They've inundated us with highways, which is a whole nother conversation that I'm gonna get to in a second. And so there's that piece, right? The city, the federal government for that matter, in Washington has manufactured a system in Washington where a lot of the Black communities are car dependent suburbs. And so we rely on cars to get everywhere. That's number one. Number two, I think the other thing that is absent in Copenhagen is the big three of Ford, Dodge, and Chevy. The role of our lobbyists to make it so that our cities were centric to cars is important. And it's an important sort of thing to remember because it's the only infrastructure we have. And so I'm not necessarily opposed to bike lanes. I think they're a good idea. I think that what I would like to see more of is a balance because where I feel like there are areas where, for example, by Congressional Cemetery, where yes, people will come up off of 295 and blow that stop sign and make a right into two-lane traffic and just get the ball in. And I understand that like this is supposed to be sort of a dual faceted measure of like traffic calming and on another hand, creating the bike lane to sort of make it safe for cyclists. What it also does is like make it very unsafe because those people are still balling through that little intersection. Right. And the only difference now is that I can't duck to the right to get out of the way of the dude in the Infinity G, whatever, riding behind me at 30 miles an hour in a 20. And so there's an element of me that, like, frankly, wants a bike lane over by my house, not because I ride my bike, but because I know it would slow people down in some concept. And so, like, I get the move, but I feel like there's a larger context of a larger political context that there isn't a massive car lobby in Copenhagen. There aren't three massive economic powerhouses that can say to the government, hey, you need to make it so that we can sell our vehicles. And as a result, the infrastructure that you build needs to be for our product, period. There isn't that infrastructure in Copenhagen. And so when we learn these lessons from overseas, I'm here for it. I think we need to do more of it. But we have to find a way to translate it to an American context. I think that something more akin to, now there's problems with it, don't get me wrong, but something more akin to like the bike path in Rock Creek is more accessible, right? A designated paved lane that's elevated and is far away from cars, right? To sort of make it so that, yes, people can walk in their walkable cities, people can bike in their bikeable cities, and people that are trying to get from Southeast Washington to UDC, for example, can do that and we can all live in harmony, right? The sort of harmony that you mentioned earlier. We can get to that, but I feel like we need to translate those sort of international concepts into an American context or reform the system, get rid of the car lobbyists and make it so that the infrastructure we have can suit this new thing you're trying to introduce into American society. But I think that what's happening right now is a lot of folks are trying to stick a square peg in a round hole, and
Exactly.
the
Yeah.
sort of result we're getting is what we have.
Totally agree. Hate is a strong word. Shouldn't say hate.
I don't hate them. I think it's a good idea to keep cyclists safe. I just think that when you're doing it and it's like making life unsafe for people that are driving, I feel like that's counteractive because this is vision zero. Right. And so if people are feeling unsafe or accidents are still happening, and it also like throws the whole traffic flow off. That's a whole nother animal. But like, if this is vision zero, let's commit to doing that for everyone, cyclists included. But let's not try and sort of like mangle this wonderful idea from Copenhagen with our Americanness.
Right.
Let's make this work. Let's make this work.
Okay, last question. Do you think there is a Black aesthetic when it comes to architecture? Or should I say, have you seen a Black aesthetic when it comes to architecture?
I don't know if I would say there's a Black aesthetic to architecture. I'm thinking back to old churches that I've seen and things like that. I think that there is a manufactured Black aesthetic that exists historically, for sure. There is, I think, in a lot of historic narratives around Black folk, the sort of one room shack, the shanty house, the shotgun house, for that matter, that exists. And they are pervasive in African American history. And so I'd say historically, for sure, there's an aesthetic that's sort of linked to the African American historical tradition in this country. Presently, I'm not sure. I'm really not sure. The things that sort of pop up to mind for me are like UDC Student Center uptown, and then like NAMAC, the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And those buildings, now that I'm like thinking about it, don't look dissimilar. Like, yeah, like UDC Student Center doesn't have like the beautiful like African sculpting on the outside, but like they're these big hulking buildings with lots of glass designed to be environmentally friendly and like have lots of metal sort of elements to them. They don't look finished in some ways. So like the sort of naked eye, like if you're walking up to Namak, all you see is like these brown holes on this big glass building. And if you don't know the sort of historical context behind it, it doesn't make sense.
Right.
Same thing with UDC. Like you walk to this big hulking building, it just looks like this big brass thing they built with big glass windows. And now that I'm thinking about it, there might be a sort of emerging sort of Black aesthetic that's sort of popping off right now. I mean, I'd be curious to see in the sort of contemporary what that looks like.
Because there's different layers to it, right? It's when it comes to land and even the buildings that's built for us,
Yeah.
we haven't built it for us. You understand what I mean? Like,
right.
There's just been white hands that's crafted it. Or like, they just like, it's kind of like chitlins, right? You need to eat. We're just going to throw you these scraps and then we whip it up and becomes a Black thing because that's all you can get. That's all you gave us. And we turned it into something similar to even the hoodie. The hoodie was not designed for us, but because a lot of us just wears it, it became us. The word woke, that was like stolen and like twisted into something that has nothing to do with anything. It's kind of the opposite. But my point is that, well, no, because the word woke, we had it, and then they took it over and made it illegal. So yeah, there's different. When you was talking, I was like, oh, well, there's different levels.
Yeah, like I think that for me, and I agree that like even in the historical context, as I mentioned, I'd argue that Black aesthetic and sort of historic African American architecture isn't one that was chosen. There's no reason why, for example, somebody wouldn't have wanted to build a brick house if bricks were made available to them, right? Like those sorts of things are real. And I will say that like it's particularly like prevalent in the South, where there are these rural communities of Black folks still around in some cases, where the only means of construction they have is what they can get. with their hands and the connections that they might have. But it's different here in that like the two home, or at least well, really both homes up in Chevy Chase for the two families that I work with. Both of them weren't small houses. I think like one of them looks sort of akin to a shotgun house, but it was 2 stories. It was pretty long. The other one is like a 2 story home and has like a market extension to it, right? And so it gets tricky. It gets tricky in some ways for me because I feel like I'm trying to like find the language for it. And I'm not an architect. And so all the architects listening, please spare me. But there is to me a particular class element that's prevalent there in that well-off Black folk here in the district, for example, were able to build these really nice homes that like wouldn't look all that out of place in Chevy Chase today. Whereas poor Black folk in the South, or in Berry Farm for that matter, didn't build these massive structures that were made out of concrete and brick and all this other stuff, right? They had, in some cases, homes with like wood paneling and siding on the outside, right? They weren't small, right? Like I saw a picture a couple of days ago of Berry Farm in 1941 with a house that was 2 stories and had like a little driveway and some other things, right? Weren't small homes, but the means in which they had to produce those homes were different. And so I feel like that aesthetic changes all according to what income brackets you're talking about and so on and so forth.
Thank you, Corey, so much for coming on.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to be here.
Thanks for tuning in to Architecture's Political Podcast. I hope you enjoyed this episode and found it informative or at least entertaining. If you like what you heard, please share with others. You can also connect with Arcus Poly on social media, currently on Instagram as well as Facebook and Twitter. For more information, visit us on our website. It's arcuspoly.online, ARCHIPOLLY.online. I also want to thank our loyal supporters who have been with this podcast for at least 3 years. It means the world to me, and I'm totally grateful to have you part of this community. I will try to bring you the best content as possible, and I can't wait to share more amazing episodes with you. If this is your first time listening, or just like a particular episode, or all of them, you can support this podcast by going on glow.fm/ArcusPoly. Again, thank you for your support. It means the world to me, and thank you so much for listening.